Snow was falling sideways over Hanover Street, the night a broken man walked into Audrey Bennett's trattoria, with a massive black mastiff at his side and nothing in his eyes but static. He didn't know his own name. He didn't know the scar on his shoulder came from a bullet, or that 3 weeks earlier someone he trusted had left him for dead by the Charles River. All he knew was that he was hungry, freezing, and this 27-year-old woman behind the counter, thin shoulders under a flour-dusted apron, blue-gray eyes hollowed out by grief and unpaid bills, was the first person in weeks who didn't look at him like garbage. Audrey had 21 days before the bank took the only thing her late father left her. She had an 8-year-old sister asleep upstairs and gossiping neighbors in the corner booth calling her a fool for feeding every stranger who wandered in. She should have said no. Instead, she slid him her last plate of pasta and told him to sit. What she couldn't have known, what nobody on that frozen Boston street could have guessed, was that the silent man tearing into her bread was Killian Holt, the missing don of one of the most powerful crime families on the East Coast, and the dog breathing quietly at his feet was wearing a silver collar that held a secret powerful enough to burn empires to the ground. If this story moves you, hit that like button, share it with someone who still believes in kindness, and subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now, let's go back to the night it all began. The wooden door closed behind the stranger, cutting off the shriek of the wind outside Hanover Street and leaving in the restaurant a heavy silence unlike anything that belonged to any other night. Bennett's kitchen was a small place, with only 8 wooden tables worn thin at the edges, 4 old red velvet booths along the exposed brick wall, and 1 long counter stretching from the entrance all the way to the back kitchen door. The smell of marinara sauce simmering slowly in a cast-iron pot on the stove drifted through the room, blending with the scent of focaccia, fresh from the oven, and the rich fragrance of olive oil. Audrey's father had specially ordered from a small farm in Tuscany for 20 years before he passed away. From the old radio resting on the shelf behind the counter, Bill Evans's jazz piano floated softly like a whisper, the music Joseph Bennett had always played on winter nights, the music his daughter still kept turning on now, as a way of believing her father hadn't truly gone far. The man sat down in the farthest corner booth, where the yellow light overhead was only strong enough to reveal half his face. Audrey set a hot plate of spaghetti in front of him, added a slice of bread, a glass of water, and a small bowl of minced meat for the dog curled neatly beneath his owner's feet. The enormous black mastiff didn't growl, didn't show any sign of caution. He only lifted his dark brown eyes to look at her for a second, before lowering his head to eat, silent and disciplined enough to send a brief chill through Audrey. Snow melted on the shoulders of the man's torn coat, each droplet falling onto the wooden floor and forming a small dark stain around where he sat. He picked up his fork, and that was when Audrey noticed his hand. It wasn't the hand of a homeless man who'd wandered the streets for years. His nails were dusty but evenly trimmed. His knuckles were broad, his joints sharply defined, and there was a thin callus running along his right index finger, the kind of callus only people who'd held guns for years ever seemed to have. He was trembling, but not with the tremor of a man weakened by hunger. It looked more like the shaking that came after shock. Audrey wiped down the counter slowly without taking her eyes off him, and she noticed one more detail, one that made her throat suddenly go dry. Even while he ate, even with his head lowered, his gray eyes still swept through the room, with steady rhythm once every 30 seconds, passing over the front door, passing over the window, passing over the 2 regulars sitting in the booth up front, then returning to the plate of food. That wasn't the habit of a man who'd just lost his home. That was the habit of a man who'd grown used to living with the knowledge that someone wanted him dead. Audrey tightened the towel in her hand. In the opposite corner, Fiona Ricci was sitting with an old friend, sipping a late espresso, glancing toward the corner booth and whispering just loudly enough for her voice to cut through the jazz. "There she goes again, Audrey. That girl never learns her lesson. Her father isn't even at rest in his grave and she's already about to lose the restaurant, and still she's bringing God knows what in here. One day, Joseph's youngest daughter will regret it when it's too late." Audrey heard every word. She didn't turn around. She only looked at the stranger, as he tore off a piece of bread to share with the dog at his feet. The gesture slow, gentle, almost tender, and she wondered how a hand so familiar with guns could be that gentle with another living creature. The man looked up. For the first time that night, his eyes met hers. Audrey went still. Those weren't the eyes of an ordinary homeless man. They weren't the eyes of a drunk or a madman. They were the eyes of a man who'd just lost something too large, so large that he himself still hadn't fully realized it was gone, And deep beneath those steel-gray eyes there was something else, something darker, something more dangerous, something asleep, but not dead. Audrey didn't know that she had just looked into the eyes of Don Killian Holt. She only knew that her heart was beating faster than usual, and she couldn't look away. That moment lasted no more than 3 seconds. But it was enough for Audrey to feel that she had just stepped across some threshold she could never walk back through. The man lowered his head to his plate and kept eating slowly, and she forced herself back to work, wiping at an imaginary stain on the counter, straightening the stack of menus, pouring more coffee for the 2 customers sitting in the front booth. But she still watched him from the corner of her eye. He had eaten a little more than half the plate when he stopped and set down his fork. His shoulders sagged. Sweat began to gather on his forehead even though outside it was a snowy night close to freezing. Then, without a single sound of warning, his head dropped onto the wooden table, his hand striking the edge of the plate and sending the fork clattering to the floor. The dog rose at once and let out a low growl from deep in its chest. A growl deep enough to make the 2 customers in the front booth sit up straight without even realizing it. Audrey rushed forward, her heart pounding. She touched his forehead and pulled her hand back at once, hot as newly forged iron. She pulled a digital thermometer from the drawer beneath the counter and pressed it into his ear. The beep sounded, 39.5 degrees. She held her breath. The dog wasn't growling anymore. It only stood beside its owner, its great bear-sized head tilted slightly to one side, its dark brown eyes looking at her with something that was almost pleading. Audrey laid her hand on the mastiff's neck, and strangely, it didn't react badly. It only let out a soft breath. Just then the restaurant door opened. Fiona Ricci stepped inside, both hands holding a paper bag full of pastries, still warm from her own shop. Her gray wool coat dusted with snow. She stopped at the threshold when she saw Audrey bent over the man slumped across the table, with the black dog beside him as big as a calf. "You've lost your mind, Audrey," she hissed, her voice ringing through the restaurant so sharply that the 2 customers in the front booth stood up, grabbed their coats, and walked out without a word. "Don't you see what you're doing? He could be an addict, a murderer, someone who just ran from God knows where and brought all his trouble here with him. The night you let this man into your place is the night you'll start regretting it tomorrow, Mrs." Ricci said, her voice shaking with worry and anger at once. Audrey straightened. She had never talked back to Mrs. Ricci in all the 10 years the woman had been her neighbor. But tonight she looked directly into her eyes and spoke each word clearly. "If I throw him back out there tonight, then tomorrow I won't need to keep living anymore, Mrs. Ricci, because I won't be my father's daughter anymore." Mrs. Ricci froze. The name Joseph Bennett carried weight in this neighborhood, and to invoke him in this moment was a blow the woman didn't know how to stop. She looked at Audrey for one more second, then bent to pick up the bag of pastries, set it on the counter, and spoke more quietly. "Fine then. I'll leave the pastries for little Layla, but you have to promise me one thing. Lock the storage room tight, and if anything feels wrong, knock on the wall. My bakery is exactly 1 brick wall away from yours." She went out and closed the door behind her, leaving a small, snowy footprint at the threshold. Audrey turned back to the man. She couldn't carry him by herself. He was nearly a head taller than she was, and probably weighed twice as much. But she shook his shoulder and called softly, "Sir, you have to get up, just to the room in the back. I can't carry you." The man opened his eyes, his gray eyes blurred by fever, and strangely, he didn't resist. He rose, leaned against her shoulder, and let her guide him. She led him through the kitchen door and into the small storage room in the back where her father used to nap on busy days. There was a narrow mattress against the wall, a thick wool blanket, and an old table lamp. She helped him lie down, pulled the blanket to his chest, and placed a damp cloth on his forehead. The dog followed without leaving him by even half a step, then lay down beside the mattress with its chin resting on its owner's paws. And it was exactly when Audrey bent down to adjust the blanket that she saw it. A thick black leather collar wrapped around the dog's neck, and in the center of it was a silver clasp shaped like a wolf's head, worn with age but carved with such elaborate detail that it looked unlike any pet accessory she had ever seen. The wolf's eyes were tiny, but inside them were 2 dark red stones like drops of blood turned solid. Audrey reached out and touched it. The dog didn't stop her. She pulled out her phone, took 3 pictures from 3 different angles, saved them into a separate folder, and told herself that tomorrow she would try to find out what that symbol meant. She turned off the light and left only the small orange night lamp glowing. Before she closed the storage room door, she looked back one last time. The man was breathing more evenly now. The fever was still there, but it no longer felt critical. The dog lifted its head and looked at her, and Audrey had the strange feeling that it was saying thank you in some language only animals understood. She locked the storage room with the only key, hid it in the drawer beneath the counter, then climbed the narrow staircase to the small apartment upstairs, where Layla was sleeping soundly beneath a quilt printed with giraffes. She sat on the edge of her sister's bed and looked at the face of the 8-year-old child dreaming her sweet dream, and for the first time in 8 months since her father's funeral, she felt that the emptiness inside her was no longer there. The next morning, the snow had stopped falling, and the weak winter sunlight slipped through the thin sheet of ice crusted over the windows, painting blurred streaks of light across the wooden floor of Bennett's kitchen. Audrey woke at 6 as she did every day, went downstairs to put on the coffee pot, but her feet carried her to the storage room door before they carried her to the counter. She pressed her ear against the wooden panel, heard the steady breathing of the man inside, and let out a quiet breath of relief. The fever had broken. She hadn't yet unlocked the door when she heard the light patter of small feet on the stairs. Layla came running down with her brown hair in a wild tangle, wearing giraffe print pajamas and clutching her worn stuffed bear. "Sis, I heard noises downstairs last night," the little girl said, her eyes bright the way they were every morning. "Is someone down there?" Audrey hadn't had time to answer before the child had already tugged at her hand, slipped past her, and run straight to the storage room door. Before Audrey could stop her, Layla had turned the knob and opened it, because in her exhaustion the night before, Audrey had forgotten to fasten the second lock. She held her breath. Inside the room, the man was already sitting up with his back against the wall, drinking small sips of water from the plastic bottle Audrey had left for him. The enormous black dog was still lying beside him. And the moment Layla appeared in the doorway, its ears rose. Audrey was about to rush in and pull her sister back, but Layla had already taken 2 steps into the room and stopped an arm's length from the dog, and instead of fear, her eyes widened as if she had just seen a miracle. "Sis," Layla whispered, her voice trembling with delight. "He looks exactly like the lion in Dad's book, the lion their father had read to the 2 sisters hundreds of times, the brave lion who guarded an orphan boy." Layla held out her hand slowly, in exactly the way Joseph Bennett had taught her since she was barely old enough to walk. Always let the animal smell your hand before you touch it. The dog tilted its head, took one breath, then rested its chin in the tiny palm of her hand. Layla laughed, a clear sound like a bell, and in the corner of the room, the man watched that scene in silence. And then something happened that hadn't happened once since the moment he had stepped into the restaurant the night before. His steel-gray eyes softened, only a little, only in a way so fragile it could have disappeared at any second. But it was real. Audrey saw it, and something in her chest tightened for a reason she couldn't name. She stepped into the room, stood behind Layla, and placed one hand on her sister's shoulder. "Are you feeling better?" she asked. The man nodded and tried to say thank you, but his voice was rough and torn with hoarseness. Audrey asked his name. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then shook his head, and suddenly his eyes went distant, as if he had just looked into a dark room and couldn't find the switch. "I don't remember," he said softly. "I don't remember my name." Audrey looked at him for a long moment. She didn't ask anything more. She only said, "Then can I call you Dane?" And the only reason was that my father's name was Joseph, and he hated that name. So he always said that if he ever had a son, he'd name him Dane. The man nodded slowly. "Dane," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it on his own tongue. "All right." Layla had already sat down on the floor beside the dog and was stroking the great head with both hands. "Mister, what's this dog's name?" the little girl asked, looking up. Dane looked at the dog. 1 second passed, then 2, then 3, and then from somewhere deep in the cellar of his memory, a name surfaced, clear as a stone rising through water. "Bruno," he said. Audrey watched him closely. "You remember that?" Dane shook his head, confused. "I don't remember, but when I look at him, that name just comes. Bruno, as if I've said it thousands of times." Audrey said nothing, but in her mind the small pieces were beginning to fall together into a shape she didn't want. After Dane changed into Joseph Bennett's old clothes that Audrey still hadn't found the heart to throw away, he followed the 2 sisters downstairs into the restaurant. Layla pulled out a Sudoku book she had been practicing with and showed Dane a medium-level puzzle. She explained the rules slowly and seriously, like a little teacher. Dane took the pencil, looked at the grid of numbers for about 10 seconds, and then his hand began to move. No hesitation, no erasing. Each number appeared in steady order, as if his mind had known the answers before he had even seen the puzzle. 2 minutes. Audrey stood behind the counter watching him, a dish towel gone still in her hand. Layla let out a cheer and clapped. "You're amazing, mister. You're a record breaker." Dane looked up, and this time his smile, though thin as a thread, reached the corner of his mouth. Then he rose on his own and walked toward the kitchen. He didn't ask permission. He didn't say a word. He only took the chef's knife hanging on the rack, turned it once in his hand, and tested the balance of the blade. Audrey watched him cut into a red onion. His hand wasn't trembling anymore. The slices were so even she could have counted them one by one. The way he held the knife, the way he tucked his knuckles in to protect his nails, the way he angled his wrist at exactly 20 degrees, that was the technique of a chef who'd spent thousands of hours on a professional line. Audrey went still, a man who couldn't remember his own name, who didn't know where he had come from, but his hands remembered how to hold a knife. His hands remembered how to solve a difficult logic puzzle in 2 minutes, and his mouth remembered the name of a dog he had never once said how long it had been beside him. She bit her lip, turned away, and for the first time she asked herself the question she hadn't dared ask the night before. Who are you? 3 days passed, like 3 years gathered into one inside a small restaurant on Hanover Street. Dane stayed, and no one discussed it. No one turned it into a question. It was simply that the first night became the second night, and the second night became the third, and Audrey discovered that having one more quiet man in the restaurant didn't make the room feel more crowded. It made the room feel less empty. On the morning of the second day, while Audrey was struggling over the weekly menu because beef had gone up in price for the 3rd time that month, Dane stood behind her, looked at the blackboard listing the dishes, and said one short sentence. "Why don't you try osso buco? Not the northern Italian style this place is doing, the old Sicilian style, cheaper, better, and the customers will come back." Audrey turned to look at him. He didn't know his own name, but he knew how many ways Italy had for braising veal shank. She smiled faintly and told him, "All right, go ahead and make it." Dane didn't need a recipe. He braised the meat with white wine instead of red, added grated lemon zest, a sprig of Italian parsley, and a teaspoon of anchovy sauce that he said was the secret of grandmothers in Palermo. Audrey stood watching him move through the narrow kitchen like a man who had lived in it all his life. When the lid came off the pot after 3 hours, the aroma spilled out through the restaurant door, and 2 customers passing by turned back, pushed the door open, and asked what the new special was that day. By evening, Audrey was writing down the sales figures, and her heart began to pound. Double the usual day. She turned and looked at Dane, wiping down a table. Her father's old shirt slightly loose at the shoulders, but fitted across the chest, and she told herself that maybe fate was beginning to give back something she had forgotten how to receive. But on the second night, hail came down from the sky. At around 10 o'clock, when the restaurant had already closed, and Audrey was counting coins at the counter, Bruno suddenly rose from his usual place beneath the corner booth. His 70-kilogram body went rigid like a drawn wire, his tail straight, his ears up, and from deep inside his chest came a low growl, the kind of sound Audrey hadn't heard once in the last 3 days, the kind of sound that didn't belong to a house dog but to a guard beast that had caught the scent of a predator. Dane came out of the kitchen at once, and the way he moved made Audrey stop cold. He didn't run. He moved low, his shoulders slightly bent, his right hand automatically reaching for his hip as if searching for something that was no longer there. Audrey looked through the window. Across the street, beneath a yellow street lamp, 2 men in long coats were standing there smoking, their eyes fixed directly on Bennett's kitchen. One of them had a long scar running from his temple down to his chin. Bruno growled a second time, and this time he stepped toward the door, both front paws pressing against the glass, his head lowered as if he were preparing to launch himself through it. The 2 men outside saw the dog. They looked at each other for 1 second. Then the man with the scar flicked his cigarette into a puddle, pulled up his collar, and both of them walked quickly in the opposite direction, disappearing into the curtain of hail. Dane stood motionless in the middle of the restaurant for a long while. Then he relaxed his shoulders and turned back inside. But Audrey noticed that his right hand was still slightly curled, as if it were gripping something invisible. "Who were they?" she asked softly. Dane shook his head. "I don't know, but Bruno knows." That night, Audrey couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the way Dane had moved when he heard the growl. Then came the cry. It rose from downstairs, low and choked. Not the cry of someone who was afraid, but of someone who was fighting inside a dream. Audrey sat upright, rushed down the stairs, and opened the storage room door. Dane was lying on the mattress, drenched in sweat, both hands clutching the blanket, his mouth murmuring words she couldn't make out. She sat down beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and called to him softly. "Dane, Dane, it's me. It's Audrey. Wake up." He opened his eyes with a violent start, and his hand shot up to seize her wrist with enough force to make her let out a small cry. For one moment, those gray eyes didn't see her. They saw someone else. Someone inside the dream he had just fallen out of. Then he recognized her, and his grip loosened at once. "I'm sorry," he said, breathing hard. "I'm sorry." Audrey didn't pull her hand away. "What did you dream about?" she asked. Dane closed his eyes. "Fire," he said. "A car burning by the riverbank. And blood. My blood. On my shirt. On the grass. There was a man standing above me, looking down. I couldn't see his face clearly, but he was laughing. The kind of laugh a man has when he's just won a game of chess." Audrey said nothing. She just sat there, her hand still in his. Dane looked at her in the glow of the orange night lamp. "Audrey," he said her name for the first time, not in the ordinary flow of conversation, but like a confession. "I don't know who I am. I don't know where I came from. I don't know who pushed me down onto that riverbank in that dream. But I know one thing, and it's the only thing I've been certain of in these last 3 days." He tightened his fingers gently around hers. "I owe you more than one life, Audrey Bennett. And whatever I am, whatever I used to be, I won't let anyone touch you." Audrey looked at him, and she knew that night something had shifted, and it couldn't be undone. That same night, exactly 4 miles west of Bennett's kitchen, across the Charles River and atop the wealthiest hill in the city, the Holt family mansion stood lit beneath the hailstorm. The 3-story house, built of deep red limestone, with stone walls nearly 1/2 meter thick and Georgian windows reaching all the way to the ceiling, had once been the place where Killian Holt sat every morning drinking coffee with a copy of the Wall Street Journal and a leather notebook containing the names of the people who were still alive by his mercy. Tonight, in Killian's own study, another man stood before the tall glass window, his hands clasped behind his back, as he looked out over the snow-covered garden. Fletcher Vance, 42 years old, with salt and pepper hair cut so precisely it looked measured to the millimeter, wore a crisp white shirt and dark gray Italian trousers, and the gold watch on his wrist was a gift old Don Holt had given him nearly 30 years earlier, when he had still been a boy running errands at the harbor. Behind Fletcher, seated in the cognac leather chair that had once been Killian's father's desk chair, were 3 men. One sat with his head lowered, not daring to raise it. The other 2 glanced at each other, each clearly hoping the other would be the first to speak. At last, the broadest-shouldered of them, Deacon Hale, captain of the harbor patrol, spoke. "We swept the entire stretch of the Charles from where the car went in, 3 miles down the current, and both riverbanks too, from the northern woods all the way to the Longfellow Bridge area. Clean report. No body, no blood left behind, no torn fabric." Fletcher didn't turn around. He only tilted his head slightly. "And the hospitals?" he asked. "We checked all 17 hospitals within a 40-mile radius, all 3 psychiatric facilities, and every public morgue. No man matching the description has been admitted in the last 3 weeks." Fletcher said nothing. The hail tapped against the window glass in an even, brittle rhythm. Then he spoke, his voice so soft that the 3 men behind him had to sit straighter just to hear him. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" One of the other 2 men, a young-faced man named Ira Weaver, who had been promoted only 2 months earlier, opened his mouth as if to offer reassurance. Fletcher turned around. The smile on his face stopped Ira's words in his throat. It was the smile of a snake watching a mouse crawl into its mouth of its own will. "He has vanished for 3 weeks, Fletcher said, each word as clear as if carved into stone. "Either he is dead, and if that's the case, then where is the body? Because I need to see that body with my own eyes. I need to put my hand on his ribs and know that my life has turned the page. Or he is alive, and you should understand this very clearly. That is the worst news I could hear in this room tonight. Because if Killian Holt is still breathing somewhere in this city, then every minute you fail to find him is a minute you are placing your own lives on the scale." Deacon Hale swallowed. Ira Weaver lowered his head. Fletcher walked to the desk, opened a drawer, pulled out a large map of Boston, and spread it across the wood. "I need you to do 2 things," he said. "First, scour the entire North End down to every alley. I want to know about every new coffee shop, every stranger who has just arrived, every restaurant owner desperate for money, anyone who might be sheltering a man with no papers. Start with Hanover Street, Salem Street, Prince Street. Second, I need you to pay special attention to a dog, a black Neapolitan Mastiff, weighing around 70 kilograms, wearing a leather collar with a silver clasp. If anyone in this city sees that dog, I need to know before he has time to wag his tail a second time." Deacon nodded. Ira Weaver lowered his head even further. Fletcher folded the map back up slowly, and before the other 3 men left the study, he added one final sentence, his voice returning to something soft, almost polite. "Remember this, the East Coast Commission meeting is exactly 10 days away, on the Saturday night of the 2nd week from now, and by the time I sit in that chair as the new Dawn of the Holt family, I don't want to hear a whisper, a rumor, or even see the shadow of Killian still hanging over this city. Do you understand me?" The 3 men answered yes in unison and stepped out. The door closed. Fletcher turned back toward the window and looked down at the snow-covered garden, and for one brief second the corner of his mouth twitched, not quite with worry, but with something closer to the instinct of a hunter who has caught the scent of prey that is still alive. He took out his phone and typed a short message to a number saved without a name. "Send more men into the North End, especially around the family restaurants." The afternoon of the 4th day began like every other Thursday afternoon at Bennett's Kitchen. The snow had stopped falling 2 days earlier, but the sky over the North End was still packed with a heavy lead gray. And out on Hanover Street, the flow of people heading home from work was thinner than usual. Audrey was standing behind the counter preparing the dinner menu. Dane was in the kitchen chopping vegetables, and Layla was sitting on a high stool at the corner of the table counting coins from her piggy bank. 3 knocks sounded at the door. Not the knock of a regular customer. It was the knock of a fist, short, hard, twice, then a pause, then once more. Audrey looked up and knew at once that no one had come for supper. The door swung open before she could answer. 3 men walked in. The one in front was about 6 feet tall, his hair slicked back, wearing a black leather coat that reached his knees, and on the right side of his neck was a tattoo of a black snake coiled tight, its head raised, its mouth open to show 2 narrow fangs. Rory Keene, 35 years old, was the most notorious collector for the Reeves family in North Boston, and the way he entered the restaurant, without a greeting, without a smile, sent a cold shiver down Audrey's spine. The 2 men behind him, one short and thick set with a red wool scarf around his neck, the other tall and thin, picking his teeth with a wooden toothpick, stood blocking the front door, as if to make it clear that no one was allowed to leave the restaurant until they were finished. Audrey stepped out from behind the counter and pulled Layla behind her. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady with the control she had learned from 10 years of running the place. Rory let his eyes roam around Bennett's Kitchen, as if he were pricing it, then placed both hands on the counter, close enough that Audrey could smell tobacco and cheap cologne on his collar. "The good news is that the Reeves family has officially taken over security for the North End," he said. "And the not-so-good news is that restaurant owners on Hanover Street now have to pay monthly protection. Bennett's Kitchen owes $20,000 for the first payment, cash, before the end of this weekend." Audrey gave a dry laugh, a laugh with not one drop of humor left in it. "I don't even have $2,000 to pay the electric bill this month." "You've got the wrong door." Rory didn't smile. He placed one hand on the counter and turned toward Layla, who was shrinking behind her sister. "Restaurants catch fire easily, sweetheart," he said to the little girl in a syrupy voice that pretended to be friendly. "And restaurants with apartments upstairs catch fire even easier." Audrey felt the blood rush to her head. She had never hit anyone in her life, but she shoved Rory's hand away from the counter and said through clenched teeth, "Don't you ever speak to my sister like that again. Get out of my restaurant." Rory looked at her for 1 second. Then he slapped her. It wasn't a blow hard enough to break bone, but it was enough to jerk her head sideways, send her hip crashing into the edge of the wooden shelf behind the counter, and drop her to her knees, knocking 2 boxes of salt to the floor. Layla screamed, and that was the sound Dane heard. The knife in the kitchen stopped for half a beat. There were no footsteps, no shouted curse. There was only Dane appearing in the kitchen doorway, still holding the chef's knife he had just wiped clean, and Audrey would never forget that moment. because his gray eyes were no longer the eyes of the quiet man she had fed on a snowy night. They were the eyes of a hunter who had just seen an animal lay its hands on something that belonged to him. The man by the door, the tall, thin one, drew his gun first. He didn't even have time to release the safety. Dane threw the chef's knife in a straight line across the room. It didn't bury itself in him. The handle struck the man's wrist joint and knocked the gun from his hand. And in that same instant, Dane had already crossed the two booths, his elbow slamming into the other man's throat, his knee driving up into his ribs, and the thin man collapsed to the floor without time to cry out. The second one, the short, heavy one, lunged from the left with a switchblade. Dane spun, trapped the man's arm in a motion only someone who had practiced Krav Maga for thousands of hours could perform with that kind of fluid ease, twisted the shoulder backward, smashed the side of his head against the edge of the counter, and the man dropped to his knees before he even understood what had happened to him. It all took less than 6 seconds. Rory had turned back by then, his hand pulling a gun from behind his waistband, but before he could bring the barrel level with his hip, Dane was already standing in front of him. Dane didn't use a gun. He bent Rory's wrist backward, with a dry cracking sound, sharp as a stick, snapping in half, making Rory scream and drop the weapon to the floor. Dane drove his heel into the back of Rory's knee, forced him face down onto the wooden floor, planted one knee between his shoulders, and tightened his grip on the broken wrist until Rory began to moan in broken gasps. Dane bent down to his ear. His voice was very quiet. "Touch her one more time and I'll tear your heart out with these 2 fingers. Do you hear me?" Rory nodded wildly, tears and mucus running down his face. Dane let him go. But before Rory could crawl upright, he grabbed his collar, hauled him up, stared straight into his eyes for 3 seconds, then shoved him toward the door. Rory dragged his 2 groaning men with him and stumbled out of the restaurant, forgetting his gun on the floor. Outside on the street, clutching his wrist as he ran, he didn't look back at Bennett's kitchen until he had made it into the black pickup truck parked 2 blocks away. The face of the man who had dropped 3 men in 6 seconds kept flashing through his mind. The gray eyes, the line of the jaw, the way he had bent down close to his ear. He had seen that face somewhere before. He was certain of it, but memory was a dark room, and right then his head hurt too badly to turn on the light. Rory Keane's pickup truck hadn't even fully faded into the distance when Audrey pushed herself upright, her trembling hand clutching the edge of the counter so she wouldn't fall a second time. Dane reached to steady her, but she gave the slightest shake of her head and stepped away on her own, kneeling beside Layla, who was curled in the corner with both arms wrapped around her piggy bank, as if it were the only float left in a flood. "You're all right, Princess. I'm all right. The bad men are gone now," she whispered, but Layla didn't cry. The little girl only looked over Audrey's shoulder, straight at Dane standing in the middle of the restaurant, and said something that made Audrey's heart tighten. "Sis, Uncle Dane saved us, didn't he?" Audrey nodded. She carried Layla upstairs, tucked her into bed with the old stuffed bear, locked the apartment door, and stood still for a full minute listening until her sister's breathing became even again before she went back downstairs. The restaurant was empty. Rory's gun was still lying on the floor. 2 booths had been shoved out of place. A slice of onion from the kitchen, dropped when Dane came rushing out, was still stuck near the edge of the counter. Dane was standing by the window, with his back to her, both hands resting on the wooden frame, his shoulders bent. Audrey locked the front door, pulled the curtains shut, and turned off most of the lights, leaving only the yellow glow above the counter. Then she walked over and stopped exactly 1 step away from him. "Who are you really?" she asked. Not loudly, not fearfully, only with the question she had held in her throat since the first night. Dane didn't turn around. "I've asked myself that 100 times in the last 4 days, Audrey." She moved around to face him. The yellow light struck his jawline and cast a shadow over the faint scar at his left collarbone, a scar she had never truly noticed until now. Slowly, Dane lifted both hands and held them out in front of himself, spreading his fingers and staring at them as if they were 2 strange objects that had just fallen from somewhere else. "I don't know," he said. "I don't know who I am. I don't know where I learned the things I just did. I don't know why I can break a man's wrist without hesitating for even 1 second. But my body knows. My body remembers every move, every angle of the shoulder, every millimeter, and I'm afraid, Audrey. I'm more afraid of myself than I am of the men who just walked in here." His voice cracked on the last word. Audrey looked at him, and she understood that the man standing in front of her now wasn't the one who had dropped 3 men in 6 seconds. He was a lost man, A man who had just looked at himself in a mirror and didn't recognize his own face. Then the last thing she expected happened. Dane's knees gave way. He didn't fall. He knelt, both palms flat on the wooden floor. And from his throat came a rough, broken sound that no grown man ever wants another person to hear. The sound of someone sobbing after holding it in for far too long. His shoulders shook once, then twice, then his whole back bent almost to the floor. Audrey stood still for 1 second. Then she stepped forward, knelt across from him as gently as someone approaching a wounded animal, and wrapped her arms around his head, drawing his forehead against her shoulder. Dane didn't resist. He didn't even lift his hands. He only let his face rest in the hollow between Audrey's neck and shoulder, and his tears soaked through the collar of Joseph Bennett's old shirt. Audrey placed her hand at the back of his neck, stroking softly through the thick hair that had gone too long without being cut, and she whispered in his ear, her voice trembling but steady. "You don't need to know who you are to be good to us, Dane. You don't need to remember your name for me to know what kind of man you are. In these 4 days, I've already seen enough. You're gentle with Layla. You share bread with your dog. You stood between me and a second slap before I could even get back on my feet. That's who you are. We'll find the rest later." Dane lifted his head. His eyes were red, his lashes wet, and for the first time since the snowy night, those gray eyes no longer had any layer of ice over them. He looked at her like a drowning man looking up at the surface of the water. Then he placed his hand against her cheek, his fingers still rough with calluses, his hand still trembling, and he kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It wasn't sweet. It was the kiss of someone who had thought he had nothing left to hold on to, and had just found a reason to cling. His mouth tasted of salt from tears, and when Audrey kissed him back, something in her chest ached with a pain she couldn't name, braided together with a warmth she had forgotten since the day her father was taken to the hospital for the last time. They pulled apart. Neither of them said a word. Dane rested his forehead against hers and breathed. Outside the restaurant door, Bruno had risen at some point, walked to the entrance, and sat down squarely in the middle of it. His face turned toward Hanover Street, ears upright, eyes unblinking, like a bodyguard made of flesh and bone, who had already understood his place in the little family that had just begun. The next morning, Audrey woke earlier than usual, but she wasn't the first one downstairs. When she came down the stairs, Layla was already sitting cross-legged in the middle of the restaurant floor, her hair still tangled from sleep, hugging Bruno around the neck and whispering to him as if they were two old friends who had finally found each other again. Dane was making coffee in the kitchen, with his sleeves rolled to the elbows, and when he lifted his head and looked at Audrey, there was a very brief silence between them. Not awkward, not spoken, only an acknowledgement that something had happened the night before, and neither of them yet had the strength to name it. Audrey poured herself coffee, sat down at the counter, and kept her eyes on her sister. Layla was playing with Bruno's black leather collar, turning it in a circle around the dog's neck, flipping the silver wolf head clasp with its 2 red stones up and down. "Sis, doesn't this wolf have red eyes like the dragon in the mythology story Dad used to tell us about?" the little girl said, pressing one tiny finger against the stone on the right. Then Layla pressed again, harder, accidentally hitting a hidden catch behind that stone. A tiny click sounded. Layla let out a gasp of surprise. The silver clasp had just opened into 2 halves like a miniature book. Audrey set her coffee cup down so slowly that Dane turned to look. Layla had already run to the counter and was holding up the opened collar for her sister to see. Inside the hollow silver compartment, carved neatly like a jewelry box, there were 2 things. A tiny black USB no bigger than half the last joint of a little finger, the kind of military-grade encrypted drive Audrey had only ever seen in one of the movies her father used to watch, and a square piece of paper folded into 4, thick paper, not ordinary paper, and on it, 2 clear marks had been engraved, rather than written, Holt, and beneath it a Greek omega symbol, omega, curved like a crescent moon turned upside down. Audrey looked up at Dane. Dane had left the kitchen and come closer, and she saw his face harden when he looked down at the slip of paper. It wasn't recognition. It was something shallower and deeper than recognition at the same time, as if that name had touched a nerve he didn't know he had. "Layla, go upstairs and play with your teddy bear for a little while," Audrey said softly. "Your Uncle Dane and I have grown-up things to do." Layla nodded with the solemnity of a tiny assistant who had just delivered classified material, then ran up the stairs. Bruno got to his feet and followed for 2 steps, then lay down again at the foot of the staircase, guarding both directions at once. Audrey pulled her father's old laptop from beneath the counter, inserted the USB, and her fingers were shaking so badly that she hit enter twice before she got it right. The black screen flashed. A window appeared asking for 2-layer authentication, and below it was a short red notice. Restricted access. Omega level. There was only one file whose name appeared without a password, a title in all capital letters, File Omega, almost 2 gigabytes in size. Along with it was a short audio file called Open First, 15 seconds long. Audrey clicked the audio file. The restaurant fell into silence except for the small speaker of the laptop. Then a low male voice came through, unhurried, unshaken, but with a layer of cold beneath it that made Audrey automatically grip the edge of the table. If you're hearing this, it means I'm dead, or I've been gone long enough for you to think I'm dead. Fletcher is the traitor. Don't believe a word he says. And don't step into any room he's been in before you. Protect Bruno at any cost. He's carrying everything. Everything I left behind for this day is inside him. And if you're the only one hearing this, then I'm sorry for the burden I just put on your shoulders. The audio cut off. Audrey didn't breathe for those 15 seconds. When the speaker fell silent again, she looked up at Dane. His face was whiter than she had ever seen on anyone. Not because of fear. Because of something deeper than fear. He was staring at the laptop speaker, as if he were looking at a ghost whose face he knew, but whose name he still couldn't say. That voice, he said, very softly. Audrey nodded slowly. That voice feels familiar to me. Familiar in a way that chills me, but she didn't say the next sentence. The one she had already formed in her mind by the 5th second of the recording. The sentence she still didn't dare line up against her own thoughts. Because if she did, then everything in the last 4 days would have to rearrange itself into an order she wasn't ready to face. Dane stayed silent too. He didn't consciously hear anything strange in that voice. He only felt it pounding against some locked door somewhere inside his head. Audrey closed the laptop, hid the USB in a small compartment behind the counter, placed the slip engraved with Holt in the same place, and when she turned back, Dane had already moved to the window and was looking out onto Hanover Street, where a strange black SUV had just driven slowly past for the 3rd time that morning. The black SUV passed by for the 4th time that afternoon, and that was what made Audrey decide she had to act that very night. She told Dane she needed to go to the bakery to buy a little flour for the next morning, and he looked at her for 1 second a little too long, as if he guessed she wasn't telling him everything, but then he only nodded and told Bruno to go with her. Audrey didn't take the dog. She didn't want him seen on the street. She carried only a small paper bag tucked inside her coat with the black leather collar and the silver wolf head clasp inside it, and she moved quickly past 3 houses to Mrs. Fiona Ricci's bakery. The bell above the door rang out. Mrs. Ricci looked up from behind the counter, already about to make one of her usual jokes, but the moment Audrey set the collar on the glass pastry display, the color drained from her face in less than a heartbeat. The blood left her cheeks as if someone had pulled a plug. She didn't say a word. She came out from behind the counter, slid the bolt on the bakery door, flipped the sign to closed, pulled the curtains across the front window, then grabbed Audrey by the wrist and drew her into the small room in the back where she kept the old oven. Only when the back room door had shut did Mrs. Ricci finally let out a long breath, as if she had just run 3 city blocks. "Where did you get this, Audrey?" she asked. And for the first time in 10 years of knowing her, Audrey heard her voice come apart. Audrey didn't answer directly. She only asked, "What does this symbol mean?" Mrs. Ricci sat down on a wooden chair, placed both hands on her lap, looked at Audrey for a long moment, then spoke slowly, as if every word had to be chosen with care. "The wolf's head with 2 red eyes is the symbol of the Holt family, sweetheart. One of the most powerful families on the entire east coast of the United States. They control the port of Boston, 3 casinos in New Hampshire, a string of restaurants stretching all the way to Providence, and they have ties to 4 other families in the East Coast Commission." She paused and swallowed. "Don Killian Holt, the current head, has been missing for exactly 3.5 weeks now. Not a word of warning, not a body, not a single line in the papers. The whole North End is whispering. The entire underworld is searching. Some say he's dead. Some say he's hiding. Some say one of his own men sold him out. And you, a girl who owes the bank $85,000, are standing here with the collar of that man's personal dog in your hands." Audrey stood still. Her heart wasn't beating faster anymore. It was beating more slowly, and every beat felt like a stone dropping into still water. She asked only one more question. What does Don Holt look like, Mrs. Rixie, Mrs. Ricci looked at her for a long time, as if she were weighing whether to answer at all. Then she said, tall, black hair, about 37, gray eyes, broad shoulders, a faint scar at the left collarbone. People call him the Iceman. Audrey felt a ringing begin in her ears. She nodded, thanked Mrs. Ricci, promised she wouldn't mention any of this to anyone, and Mrs. Ricci gripped her hand for 1 second before she left and said quietly, Audrey, child, if you're hiding someone who has anything to do with that collar, listen to me. You have to choose. Either you send him back to his world, or you step into that world with him. There isn't a third door, sweetheart. Audrey didn't answer. She hurried back to the restaurant almost at a run, locked the outside door, ran upstairs, opened the laptop, and typed 3 words into the search box, Don Killian Holt. The screen filled with hundreds of articles and dozens of images. A man in a tailored black suit, hair neatly combed, clean-shaven, was stepping out of a restaurant downtown with an unreadable face. Audrey enlarged the picture. Even though the image was cleaner than Dane looked now, even though there was no rough beard, even though there weren't those hollow eyes carved out by memory loss, she recognized every millimeter, the line of the jaw, the small scar at the left collarbone just visible above the collar, the same tight set of the mouth. It was him. Exactly him. Audrey sat still for half a minute. Then she shut the laptop, picked up her phone, and went downstairs. The restaurant was closed. Layla was asleep, and Dane was sitting in the far corner booth, stroking Bruno's head. He looked up when she came near, and the faint smile on his face disappeared the moment he saw hers. Audrey placed the phone on the table with the screen facing him. A still image. She said only 1 sentence. Your name is Killian Holt. Dane looked down. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. Then he drew in one long breath so short it sounded like he had choked on it. And from the corner of his eyes something began to fall that he couldn't control. Memory didn't return slowly the way people remember a dream. It came like a sheet of glass falling from a great height, shattering into 1,000 pieces all at once, every shard driving into him. His father's face on a hospital bed last year, his mother's face at her funeral 13 years earlier, Fletcher Vance's face standing beside the burning car. Gunfire. The sound of river water. Bruno's name called by his voice thousands of times across 10 years. He let out a roar, the roar of a grown man. Not a cry, not a scream, but the sound of a soul being thrown back into the body it had abandoned for 3 weeks. He collapsed to the floor. Bruno rose, lifted his face to the ceiling, and gave one long, low howl, the exact way a Neapolitan Mastiff howls when his master is in pain. Audrey dropped to her knees beside him but didn't touch him. He looked up after 1 long minute, hair fallen across his forehead, eyes red but clear, and in those gray eyes there was no longer Dane. There was only Don Killian Holt. He looked at her, his voice rough but every word steady. You've just pulled yourself into the most dangerous world in America, Audrey. Killian's words hung in the air between them like a blade that hadn't yet fallen. He pushed himself up from the floor, walked to the counter, poured himself a glass of water, and drained it in 2 swallows. Then set the glass down with a carefulness that didn't feel natural, the kind of care a man uses when he's trying not to break something. He told Audrey to go upstairs with Layla, lock the apartment door, and not come down until he called for her. She wanted to argue, but when she looked into his eyes now, she understood that the man speaking to her was no longer Dane, and this man gave orders in the way of someone many people had obeyed for 37 years. She went upstairs. Killian stood in the middle of the restaurant for a full minute, looking around, then went into the storage room in the back. Bruno followed at his heels, never more than half a step away. In the storage room, he pulled Audrey's old backpack down from the shelf and packed into it the only set of clothes he had. The wool scarf of Joseph Bennett that Audrey had given him on the first night, a little dry bread in a paper bag, and Rory Keane's gun, which he had picked up from the restaurant floor after the fight. He checked the magazine and slid it back into place. He spoke to Bruno, his voice rough and even. I have to go. You hear me? Stay here with her. You know your job. The dog looked at him with those dark brown eyes and didn't move. Killian bent down and kissed the top of Bruno's head very lightly, then stood, swung the backpack onto his shoulder, and walked to the front door. His hand had already touched the knob. Then one sound came. A tiny sound. On the stairs, Killian turned. Layla was standing halfway down the staircase, clutching her worn teddy bear, wearing socks with little stars on them, her hair a wild bird's nest. She had heard the sound of the backpack being zipped, or maybe she had simply felt it, the way children sometimes do when someone is about to leave. "Uncle Dane," Layla called, not remembering and not wanting to call him by another name. "Where are you going?" Killian stood still. He couldn't answer. Layla came down one step at a time, set her teddy bear on the banister, ran straight to him, wrapped both arms around his leg, pressed her face to his thigh, and said something that made the backpack on Killian's shoulder feel 3 times heavier. "Don't go, Uncle. You're Bruno's friend. Bruno will be sad." Then she looked up, her eyes already red but not yet crying, and added one more sentence without knowing where in him it would land. "My daddy already left, Uncle. I don't want anyone else to leave." Killian bit down hard. He had faced men with guns pressed to his temple without blinking, but the arms of an 8-year-old child around his knee made both his hands begin to shake. He still hadn't answered when Audrey came down to the last step. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse him. She only stood there in her thin sleep clothes, hair loose around her shoulders, tears slipping silently down her face with no one to wipe them away, and she spoke in a voice so quiet that Killian felt as though she were whispering into his chest. "I buried my father 8 months ago. I stood alone in that cemetery with Layla in a March rain. I came home and no one made dinner for me. I've learned how to live with that emptiness, Killian. I'm not asking you to stay because I have no one. I'm asking you to stay because you're the first person in 8 months who has made me feel like I don't have to brace myself anymore. Don't make me learn that lesson all over again." Killian let the backpack fall to the floor. It landed with a dull thud. He knelt down to Layla's height, lifted the little girl into his arms, and Layla threw her arms around his neck and buried her face in his shoulder. Then he walked to Audrey, holding the child in one arm, while the other came around Audrey's back and pulled her into him, and he held both of them in an embrace so tight Audrey could hear his heart beating through his shirt. "All right," he said into her hair, his voice breaking but steady. "I'll stay. But from this moment on, you follow me step by step. I'm going to take back everything Fletcher stole from me, my way. And when I'm done, you won't ever have to be afraid of any SUV rolling down Hanover Street again." Audrey nodded against his chest. The next morning, before daylight had fully broken, Killian pulled a knit cap low over his forehead, wore Joseph Bennett's heavy coat, and walked 3 blocks to an old public payphone near the Haymarket subway station. He fed in a fistful of coins and dialed a number he hadn't called in more than a decade, a sequence of 10 digits known by only 3 people in the world, one of them dead, and one on the other end of the line right now. The phone rang twice. Then the voice of an older man answered, cautious, carrying exactly the tone of a consigliere who had spent 30 years surviving in the life. "Who is this?" Killian didn't answer right away. He only breathed into the receiver in 3 measured beats, the way the two of them had agreed on long ago when he had still been a 23-year-old son entrusted by his father to Trent Ashworth's guidance. On the other end, there was silence for 5 long seconds, then the sound of swallowing, then the sound of a 50-year-old man breaking into tears. Silent tears, only jagged breaths giving him away. "Oh my God," Trent whispered, in exactly the voice Killian remembered. "You're alive. You're really alive." Killian closed his eyes. "I'm alive, Uncle Trent. And I need you." Trent drew in a breath, wiped his face, and returned to being the very consigliere Killian's father had chosen for him 14 years earlier. "Listen carefully, Killian. Fletcher has called the East Coast Commission together. Saturday night next week. The VIP basement at the Langham downtown. He'll be formally recognized as the new Don of the Holt family. From now until then, you've got 6 days. Not 1 minute more." Trent didn't waste a single second hesitating. That same afternoon, a young man of about 30 wearing a grocery delivery uniform pushed a bread cart to the back door of Bennett's kitchen and knocked exactly 3 long times and then 2 short ones. Following the code Trent had given Killian over the phone, Audrey opened the door. The man didn't greet her, didn't smile, only nodded and pushed the cart inside. When the covering cloth was pulled back, there was no bread underneath, but 2 sealed metal cases, a glossy black military laptop, 3 coils of network cable, and a set of hardware USB locks Audrey had only ever seen in movies. The man introduced himself briefly. His name was Marlowe, the Holt family's cybersecurity engineer, with 14 years of experience, the very man who had designed the encryption layer for this Omega file under Don Killian's direct orders 1 year earlier. He glanced at Killian, and in that look there was something close to relief at seeing his employer still breathing. Killian led him up to the small room on the second floor. The room where Joseph Bennett had once kept a desk. The room that now had a window looking out over the back alley and a single power outlet. Marlowe plugged in the laptop, connected the USB through the hardware lock, and typed through 3 layers of passwords in a silence so complete that even Bruno's breathing at the foot of the stairs could be heard. The screen came to life. Audrey stood behind Killian with one hand resting on his shoulder, and she felt that shoulder harden with every folder that opened. First came a line of foreign bank statements, accounts based in Cayman, Zurich, and Luxembourg, showing transfers going back and forth between an account registered to one of Fletcher's shell companies and another account bearing the electronic signature of Morgan Reeves, the 45-year-old Don of the rival family controlling North Boston. Nearly $12 million had moved between them over the last 18 months. Next came a PDF file containing the minutes of a meeting in Providence 9 months earlier, with an audio recording attached, in which Fletcher and Morgan discussed dividing the Holt empire in half after Killian disappeared, the Port of Boston, and 2 casinos going to Fletcher, the restaurant chain, and the coastal real estate system going to the Reeves family, and 1 dark clause titled the November Agreement, clearly noting that it had to be completed before the Winter Commission meeting. The third file made Killian sink heavily into the chair. It was a chain of encrypted messages that Marlowe had already decrypted. Messages between Fletcher and a single name listed only as Delta, laying out the ambush plan in detail on Interstate 93 on the night of November 2nd, the exact coordinates where Killian would be forced off the road, the number of vehicles, the types of weapons, and even Fletcher's final line sent 3 days before that night, a short message that read, "Don't let the dog survive. It knows too much." Killian read that line twice. Then he bent down, placed his hand on Bruno's head, the dog having quietly come upstairs at some point, and he smiled, not a happy smile, but the smile of a man who had just been given proof that his instincts 1 year earlier hadn't betrayed him. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "I suspected you since last spring, Fletcher." He turned to Audrey, his voice low and steady, and said that exactly 1 year earlier, he had begun noticing that meetings he had barely finished were already known to his enemies, that shipments he hadn't yet moved were somehow already being waited for across the harbor. He hadn't known who the leak was. He had only known that the traitor was sitting close enough to him to hear everything. He had ordered Marlowe to design an electronic black box and place it inside Bruno's collar clasp, because Bruno was the only living creature on Earth he trusted absolutely never to betray him. Every week, he had backed up sensitive files into it with his own hands, and he had given himself one instruction, that if the day ever came when he disappeared, Bruno would carry the truth until the right person found it. He just hadn't expected that person to be her. Audrey tightened her hand on his shoulder. Marlowe spoke then, his voice still even. "All of this data is enough for Fletcher to be judged by the Commission under the law for betraying a Don, but only if it's presented directly in person before the other 5 Dons in the room, not through a middleman, not electronically, because any digital evidence sent outside a Commission meeting room is automatically ruled invalid under the East Coast Code that has stood for 40 years. Killian nodded. "Then that means I have to walk into that room myself." Trent had already confirmed that the meeting would take place in the VIP basement of the Langham downtown on Saturday night, with all 5 Dons present, security controlling 4 entrances, phones and electronic devices confiscated at the door, and inside the room, each man allowed to bring only one object, symbolizing his family. He looked down at Bruno. He already had his symbol. The plan began taking shape in his mind, with the clarity of an old piece of music returning all at once. 6 days. Trent would gather the 30 loyal men the family still had left, and set up 2 outer rings of protection around the hotel. Marlowe would back up the entire Omega file onto 3 separate hard drives hidden in 3 different cities, as insurance. Killian would appear in the meeting room at the exact second Fletcher was about to be formally named the new Don. And before leaving the upstairs room, Killian looked at Audrey for a long time, then said something he had never said to anyone in 14 years of ruling. And he said, "If I don't come back on Saturday night, burn this collar, burn the USB too, take Layla and leave Boston, and don't ever come back." The memory snapped awake inside Rory Keane's head on a Friday morning, less than 20 hours after the night his wrist had been broken inside Bennett's kitchen. He was sitting in Morgan Reeves's temporary office in Chelsea, staring down at his hand in a plaster cast, when the halogen light fell across a poster hanging on the wall. an old poster from a charity boxing match 3 years earlier that Don Killian Holt had once sponsored, with Killian's face in the official stage photograph. Rory looked at the poster, and his broken hand went cold. He stood up, walked straight into the inner office, and within 30 minutes, Fletcher Vance knew that Killian Holt was in a small restaurant on Hanover Street, living with a giant black dog. On the following Friday night, at exactly 7:40 in the evening, hail began to fall again. Audrey had just turned the sign to closed and was drawing the curtain when Killian rose from the corner booth, where he had spent the entire day pretending to read the newspaper. He spoke briefly. "He's coming within 15 minutes. Audrey didn't ask why. She gathered Layla, already changed into thick sleep clothes, picked up the bag she had packed since noon, and moved quickly down the stairs leading to her father's old basement. The steel door Joseph Bennett had installed 10 years earlier, back when people had laughed and called him strange for saying that a restaurant owner needed a fireproof steel door, had now become the last gift he had managed to leave behind. Audrey set Layla down on the mattress she had already prepared, handed her the noise-canceling headphones and the tablet already loaded with cartoons, kissed her forehead, and said, "Just watch your movie until I knock 7 times. Don't open this door for anyone else, even if you hear my voice and it isn't exactly 7 knocks." Layla nodded. She didn't cry. She only hugged her teddy bear more tightly. Audrey shut the steel door, turned the lock twice, and set the safety latch. By the time she came back upstairs, the 4 men Trent had sent over that morning were already in position. One was hiding behind the counter with a handgun. One was in the kitchen with a sawed-off shotgun. 2 were lying in wait in the upstairs apartment, one by the window facing Hanover Street, one by the back door. Killian stood in the middle of the restaurant, with the gun he had recovered from the cash Trent had sent over. And in the instant Audrey looked at him from the staircase, she realized Dane was gone. The man standing there was the Iceman, shoulders straight, eyes cold, breath even. He signaled for her to crouch behind the counter and handed her a small loaded pistol. "You don't need to fire," he said. "Just stay low and don't come out from behind the counter until I call your name." Audrey nodded, dropped into a crouch, and exactly 6 minutes later, the streetlights on Hanover went out. The entire block fell into darkness at the same time. That was when Killian knew they had arrived. The restaurant door wasn't kicked in. It was ripped apart with an electric crowbar, the hinges flying loose with a dry crack. 6 dark figures flooded inside. Black coats, cloth masks, submachine guns. The first shot shattered the glass of the refrigerator case. The second tore through the menu board on the wall. The third never got the chance to fire, because the man in the kitchen shot first, and the lead attacker dropped with a bullet in his chest. In the span of a single breath, Bennett's kitchen became a battlefield. Killian didn't shout. He didn't bark orders. He moved. One turn around the booth, and he dropped the second man with 2 shots, one in the shoulder and one in the neck. He rolled across the floor, came up behind the kitchen counter, and took down the third man, who had been about to throw a smoke grenade, with 1 shot straight through the center of his forehead. The 4th man tried to rush the staircase, and Killian shot him in the thigh, making him collapse, then drove his boot into the man's face and knocked him unconscious. One of Trent's men upstairs finished the 5th through the window. Only the 6th remained, the biggest one, holding a glass bottle already lit, preparing to throw it at the liquor shelf behind the counter and burn the entire place down. But before his arm could swing, 70 kilograms of massive black muscle exploded from the darkness of the back storage room. Bruno sank his teeth into the wrist, holding the bottle, the bite force of a full-grown Neapolitan Mastiff, enough to crush human bone, and the bottle slipped from the man's hand, smashed across the wooden floor, and burst into a small ring of fire that Killian stamped out in 2 seconds with the floor mat. The last man screamed in pain, and Bruno didn't let go until Killian gave 1 short order in Italian, "Let go," and only then did the dog release him and plant himself across the man's chest. The restaurant fell silent. 4 bodies lay on the floor. 2 wounded men had their hands zip-tied behind their backs. Gun smoke drifted beneath the ceiling. Killian lowered his gun, exhaled, and called Audrey's name. She heard his voice and rose from behind the counter, and she ran. That was the one mistake of the night. She didn't know that the 4th man had managed to wake for 1 last second, and when he saw the shape of a woman running across his line of sight, he pulled the trigger on the handgun still in his grip until the magazine ran dry. 2 shots missed and shattered the cabinet glass. 1 lodged in the breastbone of the hanging chicken on the wall. The 4th struck Audrey in the right shoulder. She jerked to a stop in the middle of the restaurant, looked down at her shoulder, saw the red stain spreading across the white shirt that had once belonged to her father, and felt both knees give way. Killian turned at that exact second. He shot the fourth man once in the head, clean and precise, then threw the gun to the floor and crossed the last 3 meters in a rush, catching Audrey against his chest before she could hit the ground. Her blood had already soaked his hands. He bent over her, cradled her face in both palms, and in those gray eyes, for the first time in the 37 years of Don Killian Holt's life, Audrey saw something no enemy of his had ever been allowed to witness. Real fear. Trent Ashworth's windowless van was already waiting in the back alley from the second Killian made the call, and within 10 minutes of Audrey being shot, she was lying on the examination table of Dr. Eamon Doyle, the man who had treated the Holt family for 20 years without leaving behind a single sheet of paperwork. The private clinic sat beneath the basement of a watch shop on Newbury Street, all white halogen light, the smell of medical alcohol, and the steady rhythm of a blood pressure machine. Dr. Doyle removed Audrey's outer shirt, cleaned the wound, and after 15 minutes he looked up at Killian, who was standing in the corner with both hands tightly clasped, and said that the bullet had passed through the soft tissue of her right shoulder, hadn't touched bone, hadn't severed a main vessel, that she would need to keep it bandaged for 3 weeks and do physical therapy for 2 months, but that there was nothing life-threatening. Killian didn't say a word. He only stepped to the side of the table, took Audrey's left hand in his, and pressed his forehead to the back of it for the space of one breath. Trent had taken Layla to the home of one of Audrey's former teachers in Cambridge, a place where no one knew of any connection to Bennett's kitchen, and Bruno sat less than half a meter from the examination table, never leaving her side. Audrey opened her eyes, looked at Killian, and the first thing she said through dry lips was, "Go. Saturday won't wait for you." Killian shook his head. She tightened her hand around his, weak but firm. "If you don't finish this tomorrow night, then everything that happened tonight means nothing. Go." He kissed her hair, and he went. Saturday night, 8:15. The Langham downtown Boston glowed with warm yellow light through thick sheets of glass. The VIP basement had only one way down. A red Bordeaux carpeted granite staircase guarded by 4 men in black suits with white earpieces. The meeting room below was a long rectangular space, walls paneled in walnut, a ceiling 6 meters high with 4 crystal chandeliers, and a single oak table in the center, large enough for 12 chairs, though only 5 had been pulled out. The 5 dons of the East Coast Commission had already taken their seats. In the first chair sat Alistair Crown, 73 years old, Don of the Crown family of Providence, this year's rotating chairman of the commission, white-haired and dressed in a charcoal gray suit. In the second sat Francesca Belmonte, 60 years old, the only woman in the commission, Don of the Belmonte family of Philadelphia. In the third sat Morgan Reeves, 45, clean-shaven, dressed in a dark blue suit, both hands resting lightly on the table, trying to maintain a calm no one in the room believed. In the fourth sat Don Sullivan of Brooklyn. In the fifth sat Don Whitaker of Hartford. At exactly 8:30, Fletcher Vance entered through the inner door alone, wearing the black Brioni suit tailored for him the night before, gold at his wrist, shoes polished to a mirror shine, his smile under perfect control. He bowed his head to the 4 dons, winked at Morgan, and took the empty chair reserved for the Holt family representative. Alistair Crown placed a leather notebook on the table, cleared his throat, and began with the opening line the commission had used for 40 years. "Esteemed dons, tonight we gather to record a transition within the Holt family." He hadn't finished the sentence when the double doors of the meeting room flew open. Not kicked, not knocked. Someone had opened them from the inside in a way only those carrying commission access cards could. The 4 guards at the door didn't come in after him. They remained outside in silence, which meant the man entering had not been stopped. Killian Holt walked in. He wore the same black Tom Ford suit tailored 3 years earlier, still fitting his shoulders perfectly, even though he had lost 8 kilograms in 3 weeks. His hair was combed back, his jaw clean-shaven, a faint scar at the left collarbone visible above the white collar of his shirt, and beside his left leg, moving with measured steps, was a giant black Neapolitan Mastiff, wearing the black leather collar with the silver wolf head clasp and its 2 red eyes, polished so brightly it reflected the chandelier light. The entire room went still. Francesca Belmonte shot to her feet so fast she knocked over her wineglass. Morgan Reeves went pale in a single second. Alistair Crown remained seated, only his old eyes narrowing slightly, and Fletcher Vance, who had just been about to lift his glass in celebration, froze, with his hand still suspended in midair. Killian walked straight to the head of the table, did not bow, did not apologize for being late. He set a USB drive on the table in front of Alistair Crown. Marlowe was already waiting in the control room above, and when Alistair gave a nod, a hidden large screen built into the paneled wall lit up. File Omega appeared item by item. The Cayman statements,